just realizing that at the end of the day, you cannot control everything. And I feel like in the early days, that was a huge amount of stress, controlling everything. How will this clinical study go? Who will invest in the company? What will FDA say? At the end, we couldn't control any of this. At the end of the day, what led to the at-home testing was a pandemic that none of us had ever envisioned was going to happen.
Hundreds of thousands of researchers around the world are working to improve life and address imminent threats to humanity. Often their research ends up in the scientific valley of death in the form of publications and patents that never see the light of day. That is about to change. Welcome to the Lab to Startup podcast, hosted by Naresh Sunkara, founder and executive director of the Berkeley Postdoc Entrepreneurship Program at the University of California, Berkeley. This show has two main goals: share the stories of those who have successfully founded startups based on their own research, and highlight resources needed to help those aspiring to launch startups in the deep tech space. Whether it's electric cars, vaccines, addressing climate change concerns, or possibly establishing life on other planets, Naresh and his esteemed guests want to help scientists, engineers, faculty, and researchers bring their innovations to market. Learn more and subscribe today at labtostartup.com. And now, here's Naresh.
My guests today are Debkishora, Mitra, and John Waldeisen, the co-founders of Lucira Health. Since this is an extra long episode, I'm going to keep the intro very brief. Lucira Health, which was originally founded as Diassess, is the first company to get an FDA approval for at-home PCR-based tests for COVID. In this episode of Lab to Startup, we talk about the story of Lucira from the founding stage to raising over $250 million until the recently announced FDA approval of at-home flu and COVID test. Deb and John have been friends of mine for a very long time, and these are two of the most genuine humans and persistent entrepreneurs that I have the pleasure of knowing. There are so many lessons for founders here, especially those in the diagnostic space. It really takes a lot of factors to align to bring a diagnostic test to market, including luck, which is a major factor. Deb and John were kind enough to walk through the whole journey with me today. I really hope you enjoyed this great conversation.
Thank you, Naresh, for having Deb and I on today. It's a real pleasure to be able to speak with your listeners. So Deb and I first met in grad school at UC Berkeley in the joint bioengineering program with UCSF there. And so we met in Luke Lee's lab, and we'll speak a little bit more about that after. But I got my undergrad degree at Penn State University in a broad engineering major called Engineering Science and Mechanics. Deb, you want to give a little bit of your background?
Yep. Thanks, John. And thanks, Naresh, for having us over. So my name is Debkishora Mitra. I did my undergrad from the Indian Institute of Technology, Kharagpur, in biotechnology. Then I came to UC Berkeley for my PhD program. My interest in my PhD was to work on microfluidic devices for different biotechnology applications. So Luke Lee's lab was a good fit. And that's where I met John, and we're going to talk more about the journey after that.
Cool. And John, what were you working on in grad school?
Yeah, on the same thing. We were applying microfluidic technologies to push the bleeding edge of diagnostic technology. And specifically, we're focused on molecular diagnostics, which is where you target RNA and DNA detection in pathogens. And this was kind of a lot of development has happened over the past decade in this space, obviously. And as we've seen, innovative technologies like CRISPR draw more and more attention to molecular diagnostics. But where we were really focusing on was pushing this edge to make it more accessible, decentralized, so instrumentation was not needed, and more deployable into the real areas of need where infectious diseases strike most frequently. So those are often rural areas or resource-limited settings that don't readily have access to a hospital lab. And so off of that, Deb and my colleagues and myself are writing a number of grants to fund these types of ideas. And so I'll let Deb talk a little bit about the two grants that we got awarded to and really kicked off our graduate careers at UC Berkeley.
Yeah, no, I think during that time, there was an interest in diagnostic technology development, mostly focused on global health applications. We were lucky enough to get grants to fund more research on that. One of them was from the Gates Foundation, where the interest was to develop disposable diagnostic tools. And the other one was focused also similarly on developing disposable diagnostic tools, different application areas. The Gates Foundation was very focused on infectious disease diagnostics, and sort of like the original vision of the founding team that John and I were part of sort of coalesced around some of those grant activities. The grant, because I was mostly working on cancer diagnostics, and that is what my thesis was on. However, the grant sort of exposed us to the need that exists for such disposable testing technologies, because otherwise what you're getting are very inaccurate tests that are not actionable. And I think Gates funding allowed us to explore a bunch of different ideas, meet people who were working in similar technologies. And then I think we were definitely not the most thrilled when the direction moved from disposable diagnostics to more established instrument systems. And lack of that conclusion was pretty much a nucleus for us to keep exploring that. And we thought a company focused on that would be the appropriate next step, given that we were also lucky to get some NIH grant funding to kick off that research on company development.
So basically, you were two grad students in Luke Lee's lab at UC Berkeley working on developing molecular diagnostics, and you were funded by the Gates Foundation and NIH. That was the background. And when exactly did this thought of startup come into your heads? Like in academia, most of grad students and postdocs, they publish the work and they move on. Why startup? Like what was that kept you guys up at night that you could scratch that itch only at a startup?
So I think for us, like it was not a single moment in time which was like, aha, this is what's happening. It was an accumulation of a lot of things. We were lucky to get NIH SBIR funding available to us with a flexible program manager who would allow us to make a lateral move in terms of technology development. It also was a little bit of like disillusionment with the academic route and realizing that an industrial route would be a better personal option. Those would be like, for me, the two factors that sort of accumulated. And then I had the good fortune of interning at Quantalife when it was being bought by Biorad, and they were basically the pioneer in digital PCR technologies, and doing research in that sort of startup environment was very exciting. It was very different from the academic research perspective. It was very application driven, still fast, and you could see the impact of it pretty quickly. So those three things sort of created in me the desire to definitely move toward industry. And when the opportunity came to participate in a startup with folks that I very comfortable working with, became too good of an opportunity for me to pass up.
Was there a certain point of time where the technology was ripe enough? Maybe that's a better question to ask, like that you thought that you need to spin out a company, and you mentioned SBIR. What is the evolution like? Because grad students and postdocs ask me, when does one start thinking about startups? That's what I'm trying to get at from you guys.
Yeah, so on the technology side, and John, correct me if I'm wrong here, but we did not inherit much from our grad school work in our company, except for our vision. And I think a lot of the fundamental technology that the company had was developed as part of the company. So it was not as much as that there was this technology that was right, but there was this vision and which got us all excited and the opportunity to work on it. So a lot of the technology came out in those first few years after we founded the company, which put us in an interesting position. We did not have to license a lot of this technology from academia. So our journey was a little unique in that manner. John?
Yeah, I would definitely agree. So we should go back to grad school at one point, but skipping ahead to why we started the startup. One, the technology we had naively thought was ready for prime time, and that was incredibly naive. When we started meeting with manufacturers, and this is when we started the company and we were funded off the one SBIR grant for 18 months, we soon realized that our technologies that we had developed at UC Berkeley were non-manufacturable. They were not scalable. They could not be injection molded in plastic parts. So Deb and I then spent a lot of time trying to figure out, okay, using what we've learned about existing manufacturing technologies, what is out there that we could apply and essentially translate the approach and the ideas that we had developed at UC Berkeley into the real world in terms of what actually can be injection molded, what can be assembled in as few parts as possible, what is scalable. And so that was a real, I'd say, 18 to 24 month endeavor of bringing ourselves up to speed, because we had not learned any of that at UC Berkeley. Not for UC Berkeley's fault. This is just a general problem of academia, is that if you do anything that is actually applicable to manufacturing or to real world capabilities, it's not novel and you're not going to be able to publish that, right? So Deb and I, and also our third and fourth co-founder, Ivan Dimov was the third co-founder and Ben Ross was the fourth co-founder. We were trying to innovate during this time, and it was a real scramble because we had embarked on a path and we were trying to figure out how to make this into like a real world product. And things really got going once we brought in Frankie Myers and Carol Chen and Noor, some of our first employees. But personally, for me, if we go back to the question of why start the company and when do you know it's ready, often you aren't ready. You just need to throw yourself out there. Personally, I had tried to get a job and it was just really difficult. And my back was up against the wall because we had not published during grad school. I think maybe a couple of publications, but we weren't going to become professors and we weren't highly sought after grad students because we had spent 5.5 years on these grants. And these grants were fantastic for understanding the state of infectious disease testing and what the opportunity was out there. They prepared us really well to start a company, but not so well to fit into, I would say, what industry needed of PhD scientists, which for better or worse ended up, me personally, I felt like I had zero options. They had to do a startup was kind of my thinking at that time.
This is great. I'm glad we're able to talk about this more because I think there are a lot of grad students in this similar boat. And I want to go back to what you were doing. Basically in grad school, it was a science project. It was easily fundable using grants. What was missing was the translational part of it, like how do you build a product? You were in love with your technology because you know how to do things, but you didn't know how to translate that. And that is what is happening at the startup phase. I think one important piece we didn't talk about was what was that problem that you're trying to solve apart from the technology in terms of a market? What was that vision you had in your minds of like, oh, this is the cancer diagnostic or malaria diagnostic? What was going on in your heads about the perception is what I'm trying to get. And how was it different from the reality?
So I was kind of doing the company solo while Deb was wrapping up his PhD. So I had spent some time diving into the market, realizing, okay, investors aren't going to invest in any market size smaller than $1 billion. I had come out thinking, okay, what about a malaria diagnostic? What about a schistosomiasis diagnostic, which is prevalent infection in Southeast Asia, for example? And I soon realized the malaria diagnostic is like a $50 million market size and largely purchased through WHO. And I was like, oh, this is not a company. Then we started looking at, okay, what can the technologies do? And anything from rapid genetic testing, which doesn't make any sense, but it was on the table at that time, to try and do okay, can we maybe do some like cardiovascular tests with antibodies? And then soon realized, okay, the technology wasn't that appropriate for that. And then we finally landed on, well, there's this STI, STD, sexually transmitted infections market. That is $1 billion market. It actually is much larger than that. And then you start to learn about, okay, well, people don't want to go to an STD clinic. They don't want to have conversations about your doctors. And you start diving into that market. Privacy is top of mind there. At the time, Tinder had just come out as an app. So people were a bit more promiscuous and spontaneous relationships were becoming more available. So STD testing was becoming rapidly more important, especially in the public health conversation. So all these things started coalescing, these secondary and tertiary characteristics of why you go after a certain market. And so then we were like, wow, okay, we may be able to do this. We may be able to do RNA, RT-PCR reaction in a disposable format. On that path, a number of key events happened, one of which Deb came up with this ingenious mechanism to passively power fluid actuation. Amazing technology that for the first time allowed liquid pumping without having to use an external power source. So there's a couple of key moments like that. Second key moment, I think, in terms of the technology is realizing that a PCR reaction can become colorimetric and that you can actually see that by eye. In fact, the first early generations of our test where someone could just look at the DNA being amplified. And that was so crazy because you had grown up and you've been educated that you needed fluorescent intercalating dyes, you need sensors that detect it, this highly sensitive reaction. And then in our lab, we're like, mixed a couple chemicals together and we're like, holy smokes, we can see the reaction taking place by eye. Are we the first humans on Earth to be able to see this? So there's a couple of cool technologies that really led up to then we're like, okay, now we're rolling. We really got something here. And it wasn't one technology. It was several. And it was several people developing these and several ideas and just having the right assortment of brilliant minds around the table.
And partnerships. We were also lucky to get in touch with Dr. Deborah Dean, who was at Children's Hospital at that point in time, who is an STI expert, but also someone who is very interested in working with entrepreneurs. So she collaborated with us, helped us get some of those early grants that really accelerated that molecular diagnostic development focus within the company for STI testing. So yeah, technology, people, and collaborations were key.
Yeah, I cannot emphasize how important those early collaborations are as a proof of concept, like Deborah Dean. And I think there's always a Deborah Dean in most startups that outside of startups helping them get the grants. And give me some timelines. When you do incorporate the company, I think that's a nice segue to talk about money a little later. How long did you have to be at the startup without money or a salary?
So the founding of Diassess, which then became Lucira Health, I submitted my PhD thesis in December 2012. A couple months prior to that, Ivan Dimov had been working with Ben Ross on submitting SBIR grants to get the company Diassess funded. And so they came to me in January and they were essentially like, hey, we have this SBIR grant that we were awarded. Would you be interested in taking that on and running the company? There's a couple personal reasons for them why they needed to pursue alternative paths, but they didn't want to just give this money back to the NIH. So I was like, this is fantastic. It's been very hard for me to find a job and I really wanted to start a company. And so I was like, yes, absolutely, I'll do this. And so the company wasn't even created at the time. So I had to incorporate it. I had to get it set up. And I think it took probably 6 months to start to be able to draw funds from the company. And so QB3 was critical at that time to get us lab space. In the beginning, I was working with an intern, Jennifer Bone, I believe at that time, and we were essentially setting up reactions in QB3, driving them on ice to my second bedroom in my apartment. The thermocycler, incredibly loud, was in the second bedroom of my apartment, and we'd run reactions, and we generated the first data, the colorimetric data, that way. So it was very tumultuous. A couple times I drove too fast or spilt the ice in my car and we had to redo the reaction, for example. The first 18 months is really trying. We were really struggling fundraising. I think at that time I'd spoken to over 60 investors, seed investors, trying to raise a round. I had about $3,000 in my bank account. Really didn't know how I was going to make rent the following month. I had asked my girlfriend and now wife at the time if she would be able to spot me $800 to pay for my half of rent. It was just really stressful times. And then a week or two later, the 60th investor we met said, absolutely, I want to lead your seed round. And we pulled it out in time that we'd raised a $2 million seed round. At that time, pre-seed didn't exist. So maybe it was family, friends, and stuff. Naming seems to change every 10 years in terms of this. And then 10 years prior to us starting, seed wasn't a thing. It was Series A was your first round. So that's kind of the beginning. And it was so much stress financially. And there's kind of a lack of support. Things are so different. Like right now, Berkeley has Skydeck, and these things are all fantastic. And there's a network you can get plugged into. We got plugged in through Ivan Dimov. We got plugged into the Stanford StarDex network. In 2013, it had just started 2 years prior. It was the second incubator or accelerator after Y Combinator, and we got plugged into a fantastic network there. So just finding that support network was so amazing in 2013, 14 when we started to get going.
Wow, this is fascinating because this is not too long ago. 2012 is about 10 years ago.
Yeah.
We didn't have the infrastructure or the ecosystem to help build. This is not even a startup out of the garage story. It started out of a bedroom story. We're running your PCR reactions. And like, we're going to dig down a lot of details. Like, and when did you join, John?
So I graduated July of 2013. So I think John and I have been talking prior to that. So when I graduated, I sort of transitioned over to the company. I think end of July, early August, something in that range. I was on my student visa. So I got on to my OPT and was basically transitioned that over to Diassess for about 6 months. Now, during that time, as John mentioned, the fundraising roller coaster, or not even a roller coaster, it was more like you talk and they said, no, I don't know what it's called. But basically, that whole thing was going on. And for me, finance aside, immigration was a big concern for obvious reasons. And we engaged with some counsel through QB3, did not come up with any good paths out. The short answer is if the company doesn't have money, you're not going to get sponsorship for the visa. And for Indians, the path is extremely convoluted, takes a lot of time. And on top of it, if you are not doing research and like the most cutting edge of science, visa options are not really accessible. So the decision that I had to make was I had to transition my employment from Diassess. So we were applying for grants and still, because that was basically the goal there, was to finish some of those grant applications, finish some of that key data collection. And then 2014, I think January or February, I transitioned employment to another startup, but which was funded, called 10x Genomics. So that's where I spent the next 11 months as primary employment, got my H-1B visa figured out. And during that time, John was able to raise the funding at Diassess so that the visa could be transferred over. So then basically I took a hiatus for 11 months. And then by the end of 2014, I was back at Diassess.
Wow, that's such a convoluted and unfortunate immigration issue that a lot of grad students and postdocs still go through and like keeps them away from entering startups.
I think it's critical area that needs to be addressed. I mean, Deb co-authored lead PI on over $20 million in government funding. I don't know what the exact total was, 24, 25, but 20 million of that was from BARDA, the Biological Advanced Research and Development Authority. So it's just amazing that the government can award such a large amount of money to a PI, the CTO of Diassess, but then this CTO, this PI still struggles to get a visa for the country and stay in the country. Yeah, it's completely ludicrous.
I think the immigration system since then has made some moves, but still a long way to go.
Yeah, I don't know when it's going to change, but I'm glad you came back to Diassess and talk about the team. It's funny, we had a conversation earlier about how grad school and postdoc training doesn't teach you shit about building companies or building teams. Talk us through that evolution of learning process of how you guys build teams, each of you in your own ways. You from building a technical team, you from building the whole company.
I was really terrible at hiring and organizing teams early on. There's a lot of learnings in our early employees and colleagues were incredibly patient and forgiving. I have a lot to say on this, but I guess up front, it was definitely a learning curve. And so one of the first things that we instilled was kind of this culture just through who we were hiring of just being transparent and accountable. And a lot of our early colleagues could call us out when we did things wrong and they wouldn't obfuscate any of their concerns. And it was just amazing to be told that what you're thinking or what you've said is wrong is one thing, but to be able to do it quickly and to have a relationship that's trusting, and that was incredibly important. I think we were fortunate to have an early stage team that was able to do that. And so as we made mistakes, we're able to adjust them really quick.
Exactly. I think the founding team, there was no magic formula or method. It was fairly organic in a sense. There were some people that were in our network already who we knew like Frankie as an example, knew their potential, their capacity. So that one was where we went in with a lot of data behind that decision. But then there were other hires where it was through a process. You put a JD out there, you get resumes, you screen through that, talk and all of that. And again, not all the decisions we made were right. We did have some amount of turnover, thankfully not a huge amount. And that was directly related to us making decisions which were not necessarily the good decisions for people. So it was like learning through that. And I think for us, a big piece that came out of it was, for better or worse, not having been extremely successful in grad school did not create in us this sort of mindset that it's my way or the highway. And I think that's what John was referring to of transparency and accountability, is making sure that we had an open door for feedback, concerns, anything from that team, and giving them the ownership of building the company with us, rather than being employees at a firm that was being built. And I think that was, again, not a conscious decision. Obviously, we can reflect back on it now and make connections. But at that point in time, it was more or less the two of us depending on the founding team and giving them our trust. And as a result, getting back from them their motivated focus on making sure that what they do for the company is in the best interest of the company.
So transparency, I think what that gave you is like feedback from your teams.
One colleague comes to mind, and she was just fantastic at giving feedback in real time. And she was living the radical candor moment years before the book came out. So that was incredibly important. And then I think another unique thing about our grad school experience, I think, was that Deb and I and our colleagues, Ivan Dimov and Ben Ross and Rick Hendrickson and Brendan Turner and Charlie Ye from Luke Lee Lab, we were kind of in a group, which Professor Luke Lee would call the Tiger Team. And so we essentially had a good 3-4 years of real intense work. DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA wanted us to report every 90 days, every 3 months. And so we would have to provide a report. We need to get work done. There's a lot of group work. We had to create and submit reports together. We had to, I think every 6 months, we had to fly across the country to Washington, D.C. to report to the lieutenant colonel that was running the project. We'd see the other competitors on the grant there. It instilled in us urgency, how to self-organize, teamwork. And these are things that in a PhD, you do a lot of independent work. You're not doing teamwork. On the other hand, is that because we're doing so much applied research, applied physics, applied science, you couldn't publish it. But we were doing a lot of work. Same thing on the Bill and Melinda Gates grant. We would fly up to Seattle every 6 months and go report. I think they also had either a 3 or 6 month reporting structure. But these two grants put a lot of pressure on us, on the team. And I think Deb and I and others were able to start to understand who makes a good team member, who gets their work done, who executes. And we came into Diassess with at least that skill set. Hiring is a different skill set, but at least we knew that when things weren't working out, we could start to recognize that. But that teamwork experience was so crucial and unique in our lab. And our lab was also doing a lot of diverse research, everything from plasmonic research to molecular diagnostic research to like silk type research and stuff. So it's pretty unique experience.
I want to make sure I give clarity to the audience, like lab as in your academic lab.
Academic lab, yes.
That's right.
Yeah, and then your team was all the people that were working that followed you to the startup?
No, so basically in the academic lab, we worked in this highly collaborative nature. We both had a network, but also picked up cues on on what is making sense, what is working, what is not working. That translated to when we started working at Diassess is when we brought people in. During the interviews period, we were able to ascertain to a high degree of extent, would the team members be able to work in that kind of a collaborative. We wanted to create that kind of a collaborative work environment that we experienced while in our academic lab. But hiring always does not translate. So for us, I think that need for a collaborative work environment created all those downstream things of transparency, making sure that everyone has a seat at the table, everyone has accountability, all of that.
Thanks for clarification of that point. Before I go into the funding aspect, I want to touch on that radical candor. Give us an example of what that radical feedback was like.
I should have brainstormed better examples ahead of time, but these are kind of moments when you may be in front of your team and you may be corrected and it may leave your face flush red or something. Those moments are really important for a founder of a startup to be able to take that with humility, accept that maybe they're incorrect, and to encourage more of that behavior of quickly correcting flaws and maybe your thinking or what you've said in the process. And so there was a couple employees early of the founding team at Diassess that were just incredible at doing that. And so it's hard for me to think of examples, but I know it happened almost daily. So,
But I think the fact that John and I cannot recall specific instances is the point of the whole thing, because it became such a common thing. And not always, right? Like, I think candor is neither positive nor negative. Candor is candor. But what it did was that it did not create any sense of resentment or anger or something that you hold on to that you can remember like 10 years down. Like, that one time this person said that to me. No, it was just more like how things got done. People were open to express their feelings about direction of the company, about data that we are generating, about investor calls, about what snacks we have in our kitchen or do not have in the kitchen.
not lack of.
Yeah, or lack thereof. Everything was under that whole thing. And
Salaries, we
salaries, yeah.
had a transparency salary scale. We tried to do the same thing, I think, with equity based on positions. So the more transparency, the better. I think generally not everyone's going to be happy, but at least if you can be transparent about things, it'll work out much better in the long run. It'll set things up in a kind of automatic way. When we did a job offer, telling them what the current fair market value of the stock is, what's the offer in terms of dollar amounts, that type of thing. It's all important. From there, all the way down to, are we selecting the right predicate for our clinical trial and the comparator test that we're going to use? And how do we assess data? It's just everything across the entire spectrum.
That is great. I mean, what you're talking about is culture.
Yes.
I don't know how thoughtful you are about creating that culture, but I think that is a fantastic one to have at early stage startups. One other point I wanted to bring out before you move on is egos. A lot of founders come with huge egos, I think. I've known you guys for a long time. I think you and John and Deb are most down-to-earth people that I personally know of. It's a rarity. How did you get there? Did you have egos that was killed at some point? Or
I definitely probably had one coming out of Penn State because I was a fish in a small pond. I wouldn't even say big fish. But then I got incredibly humbled when I started taking molecular and cell biology courses at UC Berkeley. I think my course correcting on the ego side happened at UC Berkeley. And I think I really got right sized there, which was great. And also, it's good to have confidence in what you're doing and be stubborn. But yeah, sometimes founders have egos and it's a double-edged sword and it's a balancing act because you have to go into investor meetings and say, we're going to do this and it's going to be the greatest company ever and you're missing out. And I think that's why, for a number of reasons, why it's good to have a few members around the table, the founding team, that can complement each other. And then if a founder can then check his or her ego at the door before they walk into the office, I think that is honestly the best for the company operationally.
I would not say I do not have ego. However, I think for me, that ego and pride resides more on the people and the networks that I have or I surround myself with, and less on individual successes. And I think for me, it has been going through ups and downs so consistently in my life that it has almost become a habit where I don't even think about it per se. And I think to John's point, right, like that does not mean a lack of ego is not a lack of confidence. To me, ego is a blinder that prevents you from being distracted. And I think it's very good to have ego in certain aspects so that you can go down a path and then get something done. But at the same time, if the ego for a founder, I think, unless it's a founder who has done the exact same company, start to finish, and knows exactly this one step that they would have done differently and they got a restart, then different story. Most founders are not like that. Most founders don't know what the hell they're doing. They are learning on the job. They're learning what the business is. They're learning what the market is. They're learning what the technology is. And in that scenario, having a lot of ego on your initial thoughts or initial predictions is going to make it difficult for you to course correct. And for us, we have course corrected so many times through the journey, mostly because for us, it was not personal attack or personal defeat if that happened. That's the lack of ego, I would say, understanding that everyone's opinions can change, market realities can change, everything changes. I think that change is a constant. And if you embrace that, then it's not a matter of not saying that I don't have ego, but rather understanding the fact that you as a person changed. The world has changed, and whatever you thought of 6 months ago may not be applicable anymore. Doesn't mean that you were wrong 6 months ago. For me, maybe that's the key thing there.
You both bring up some very good points there. I think when you have that open communication with the team members and you make it clear that you can attack each other, not personally, but attack the idea or the thought. We can be wrong about that. And when you don't take that personally, I think that's where ego comes in. Like if you're egotistic, you take that personally that somebody's attacking you, and that's when shit goes down. And that's a lesson I learned from a couple of people previously. I think that's a good one for other founders to keep in mind. All right, let's move on from the team side to the fundraising. John, you mentioned you raised about $2 million with the 60th investor that you met. Talk about that fundraising. Before that, why were the 59 people saying no? Any lessons taken away from them? And we can get into the phase 2 of that fundraising from there. Just in terms of for a founder trying to raise money. I know everybody's got a different story, but you got to kiss 59 frogs before.
Exactly. One, I think it is incredibly important, I think, to have grant funding early on. I think it is important to show that the concept's been peer reviewed. You've gone through the process of writing out your idea. That 6-page research plan is incredibly important for you to formulate your ideas, to do the experiments, to make the figures, and to go and do the work. Now, I think over the past 10 years from the biotech bubble, right? Biotech was the highest ROI in all of VC over the past 10 years. 2000, 2010, it was SaaS. Last decade, it was biotech. It's been easier to fundraise in the biotech. Now founders can come out with an idea and a pitch deck and fundraise. That's good. But at the same time, I think there's been a loss of that rigor of doing the work, doing the experiments, formulating your ideas on paper. Now, not every company needs to be grant funded in the beginning, but it is, I think, very important indicator of success. And I still think that correlates well with a lot of the companies I've seen. So when you're ready to move on and do that fundraising, each investor in the beginning will provide you feedback. And so the way we operated was we created a tiered list of investors, A, B, C. The top tier is the top tier VCs. You go out and you practice on tier C. You get the feedback, you see where the holes in your ideas are, and then you iterate. You update the pitch deck, etc., right? And so the goal here is that you start to build what's called a soft circle, right? I'm sure you had other guests talk about fundraising, so feel free to push me along if I'm hanging up on any place that's covered already. But you start to build a soft circle. Ideally, you start to have people saying, oh, this is interesting. Keep me in the loop of when you're going to close your round. And so that's when you know your pitch is starting to get pretty good if you start building a soft circle that's going to become interested. Now, once you get that soft circle, the real key here to catalyzing, crystallizing it is to find that lead investor. In my experience, it's been an institutional micro VC or pre-seed fund or whatever that will put in 50% of that round. So if you're raising $1 million, they're going to put in 500, or maybe find 2 leads that do $25K each for that 500,000. And then at that point, once you get those leads, you can get like a solid commitment on the 50%. Then it becomes really easy to pull in the other 50% of the soft circle. Obviously, the soft circle needs to be much larger than what you're raising. If you're raising $1 million, that soft circle should probably be 2. And then that's kind of like how we went about fundraising. and you're going to get a lot of no's. The key is to take a lot of meetings in a short period of time. There's a lot has been written on this, but I think from the numerous rounds that we've raised is generally, I think it is incredibly important that you do find that non-dilutive funding early on in the company. For us, it was critical for our first few patents to, as we moved from an academic idea more with real industrial applicability, those grants, those SBIR grants were incredibly important. And then Deb is going to talk about when you should really take VC funding from our perspective. And granted, our perspective is a very difficult market. Historically, the returns have been a fraction of those of the biotherapeutic and pharma markets. The timeline for the diagnostic market is much longer than therapeutic exits and medical device exits. Every startup is hard in its own ways, but with diagnostics, it has a lot of metrics going against it. It's one of the hardest space to fundraise.
Yeah, so I think building on that, and at least our personal experience has been that private money drives a certain kind of activity in an organization that wherein you are focused on getting a return for their investment in a defined period of time. So I think, one of our early discussions, we were talking about it being like adding yeast in bread making. You need that to get the rising of the bread to start. But if you put it before you have mixed all the ingredients or gathered everything, then that's going to be a problem. The good thing with non-dilutive funding in technology, biotech sort of industry, you have a lot more research risk that is involved. And that research risk, if you use private money to de-risk that, you can get lucky, right? And boom, 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 everything works. However, it does not allow you the flexibility to sort of like learn and edit your path or change your path and try again on the science side. Non-dilutive funding allows you to, for example, try a wide variety of different application areas of your core technology and see which one you can actually get going. Once you have that and once you have your market understood, at that point in time, bringing private money in is going to both be easier, but also be better for the company because you are not trying to drive the company towards a return point when you don't even know which way to drive. So I think early on, getting angel or friends and family private investment in where they understand that you are in the discovery period is fine. But the moment you go institutional, when they have very fixed algorithms that they're trying to fit you into, it may be easy to raise the fund, but it will be harder to keep justifying why it takes a certain amount of time. You may be forced to move in directions that may not be in the best interest of the company or make decisions that are in the best interest of the company. So non-dilutive funding allows you to sort of get to that proof of concept point from where you can add the yeast.
Great. Thanks for that plug-in. John, you mentioned something about your mental model of one-to-one grants to non-dilutive funding to venture money or private money. Talk about the evolution of that fundraising. How much money do you guys raise before you're going public? Talk about plugging the SBIRs and other grants that you got and how that helped with the raise the venture money actually.
Yeah, so in grad school, Deb and I and others had authored about $2.5 million from DARPA and Gates Foundation. We then started the company with, I think the first grant was $148,000 or something like that. And that lasted us 18 months, minimal salary. I think I paid myself $23,000 over that 18 months or something, just barely hanging in there in the Bay Area. But my mental model from our experience at Diassess is I generally think that the grant money to the VC money is roughly 1-to-1. Then we started winning phase 2 grants and more phase 1 grants. And I think we had about $2 million in non-dilutive money came in and we raised the $2 million seed round. VCs love that, doubling the money that they put in. Then raised a $13 million Series A in 2015. And then I think about 2 years later, we had a $20 million BARDA contract come in. So plus or minus some variability in the time frame, generally, I think you'd want about 1-to-1 in non-dilutive money in ratio to your investor money they take early on. That was through Series A for us. The company continued to then thereafter only take investor money, I believe, and through Series B, C, and then I think IPO. But generally, early on, obviously grant funding, the money is the most valuable. It's also formulating, as I said before, formulating your thoughts on paper, working with a collaborative partnership. We worked with Dr. Deborah Dean at UCSF Children's Hospital. She really taught us about how to grant write really well. I believe her undergrad degree was in literature, and she has an MD. And so she's an amazing colleague, and we're so fortunate to have her as a grant collaborator. I think it's very hard to find professors that will be good collaborators with startups, and she really helped us hone our grant writing skills. A lot of professors are just super busy and they sign up for every opportunity. Dr. Dean really taught us a lot. She was kind of like under the radar enough that she's not a George Church who you see on a lot of startup pitch decks, and she gave us time. We met with her weekly. It was obviously this project was important to her. She put students and postdocs on our project. It's that kind of relationship and motivation by the professor PI at the academic institution. It was just really, really great for us. And Deb worked more with her than I did, so Deb's probably best to talk about that.
I think on the grant side, I think having that partnership was very useful to us to get training for us. In an academic setting, you are not necessarily trained on grant writing at the PhD levels. We had exposure and we were lucky for that exposure. A lot of that exposure comes in during your postdoc period. But that too is very focused on an academic R01 strategy. SBIRs inherently are very unique in the sense that they require the business side of it. Not as much in phase 1, but in phase 2 for sure. And now I have had the opportunity to also review SBIRs for NIH and NSF, and being on the other side has given me even more perspective on the value of the education that we got from Dr. Dean, on like what are things that reviewers want to see, what are things that we need to clarify more, figuring out what the business plan is with certain details there. We also worked with contractors and consultants for the early on ones to, again, get that basic best practices named out. So I think the first time around, there was a lot of learning, and I think just surrounding yourself with people who have been through the process helps accelerate that significantly.
Yeah, you make a very good point, both John and you, Deb, about finding that collaborator. You can have a George Church on your pitch deck, but then it'll be hard for George to spend time with anybody because it's super important and busy as well. Somebody who's going to put the skin in the game and work with you guys is the partner that you want to find. Let's keep moving on with that fundraising part of it. What kind of investors were interested in your startup? I ask this because I'm assuming you're still in the STD space at this point when you got your DARPA funding, and the kinds of VCs that took the bait, if I may call that, or were interested in investing in your company.
We got tied into StartX down in Stanford and affiliated with Stanford. And so we started getting a lot of feedback on our pitch deck, our pitch, and from other founders that were raising money, had raised money. So we got a lot of great feedback from that. We also got exposed to that network. So we would go and meet with health tech VCs, and the VC world knows what the metrics are in each of the different areas that they're investing in, right? Like I mentioned earlier, medical devices and biopharma often outperform diagnostics, for example. For us, it was really, really impossible to raise from health tech VCs early on. So we ended up Data Collective, which is a tech investor. They led our seed round. They really were just well aligned with what we were trying to do to decentralize testing, but mainly, really, if you can do that, then there's this huge opportunity in data around like geographies, mapping disease outbreaks, understanding where you need to get the therapeutics, just the analytic side of this, of understanding how outbreaks occur, understanding who's using your test at a population level, a geographic level, how you can quickly adapt and reduce anything from a common cold or flu outbreak to a pandemic. They had invested in similar infectious disease companies, and so we kind of fit into their fund thesis. And so then they invested in us, and then Seraph Group was a large angel group of typically executives from Fortune 500 companies from Pepsi to Ford. And so just a really wonderful angel group, really professional. They just continued to support us through the entire journey, just wonderful people. Those were the two big investors, and we had a handful of smaller investors in our seed round. So really, we didn't have any health tech investors in our seed round.
Interesting. I asked this question to my other guests as well. There are a lot of interesting venture capitalists and investors out there, and there's a lot of noise. And how did you travel through that path of differentiating signal from noise? And did you come up with any lessons of the kinds of investors you want to avoid?
Yeah, I think for us, our Series A was difficult. I've seen it with other companies and our own company. It's kind of like a roller coaster. One round will be pretty easy, and the next round will be incredibly difficult. It may end the company. And then maybe the next round after that will be incredibly easy. So it's just like it'll oscillate. So our Series A was really, really difficult. We always want to have plan Bs and plan Cs. Our plan B was like, if we couldn't raise a Series A with our prototype and the evidence we were generating, the data, our plan B was essentially to go through Y Combinator. And at that time, a lot of companies were going through Y Combinator for seed round. The co-founders, we all spoke, talked about this, and kind of thought this is a good backup plan. If we struggle to raise Series A, then let's go through YC. Puts us in the best footing to raise a Series A. And so that ended up being true. And we raised from Eclipse Ventures in our Series A. We had a huge soft circle at that time. We just needed to find that lead investor that the soft circle would follow. So fortunately, that was Eclipse Ventures. And so they invested in the company. And that really got things going. We were able to expand the company and start to do some serious clinical trial work that we had not been able to do prior to that, and also allowed us to start doing some serious prototyping and design for manufacturability at that stage, which had previously just been proto lab parts or just 3D printed parts. Once you can get into injection molding and start doing that, you really start to see the problems in your product. And it's a whole nother almost development cycle to go from the prototype to actually manufacturing the hardware and then dealing with all the adjustments that you need to make to your product to address those. I know we were talking about fundraising. That was kind of the stages, if I remember correctly. Deb, feel free to correct me if...
No, I think you've got the details right. I think the main thing, going back to your question, Naresh, about what investors to avoid and that stuff, I think we were never in a luxury space to make those calls. For us, it was throwing a big enough net and trying to find that lead. Having gone through it, definitely there are things that for the next journey we will look for, but back then we were not necessarily in a position to be extremely selective.
Yeah, and just do your basic homework. It's like same as the hiring process. You want to get recommendations of the VC partner that you're going to be working with. You want to talk to founders that they sit on the boards of their companies. What have they done for the company when you guys were struggling? Have they introduced you to people? Have they been supportive of you personally or of the company? How have they been supportive? Like, do the recommendations, and you can quickly get a picture and representation of what that VC partner is going to be like. In general, I do prefer and often advise founders to find VC partners that generally, the more hands-off, the better for the founder. If the founder wants to stay as the executive in the company and running the company and the lineman of the company, I think it's generally, those are the better investors to have. Now, sometimes founders don't grow with the pace of the company, or the company outgrows a founder and all this other stuff. But generally, I do think more often than not, investors kind of get in their own way of the progress of the company. Those are some basic things you can look at. VCs have a history. If they prefer to replace founder CEOs, that's clear in their history, and you can easily pick that up. There's also founders that are incredible connectors and really supportive of companies, and they'll connect you with ex-FDA members or ex-people that run clinical trials. And so it is really a diverse amount of investors out there. But at the end of the day, for us, if you have few options or one option or no options, you really just got to do everything you can to keep the company going. The other thing I think these days is there's a lot of, and there continues to be a lot of, let's raise a big $30 million fund with the list of name brand VCs and name brand angels who follow the VC and stuff. And that's a great signal, but who's that really benefit? Like, I think if you're hiring, that helps hiring the maybe some mercenary talent. I think we were always in the fortunate circumstance of the mission of the company really drew you wanted to work and be on a team with us. So having a mission-driven company helps in generally for that. That applies to a lot of biotech companies. But like doing the name brand VC thing, that's great. Do it if you can, but you can still be successful without that, I guess is the point I'm trying to make.
Cool. Thank you. That's a nice segue to talk about pivots, because what you guys are known for is COVID. You started with STDs. How did that pivot happen? And was that the only pivot you guys had to go through?
The company has gone through a few pivots. I think we started with STD testing as our main focus. And a couple of years into the company, the first CLIA-waived flu test got authorized. And that sort of created this realization that there's a regulatory pathway that exists that at least is moving in the right direction. So that added to the fact that the flu clinical studies were less burdensome because you could do it with a much smaller population compared to an STD, as well as other just general development costs and timelines associated with that. We made a pretty important, and it was a long decision of making that pivot to go from STD testing, because that's what we had used in our earlier pitches for fundraising. Our grants were around STD, and made that pivot to go from STD to flu. That pivot was interesting because our focus initially was to go into clinical settings. So while our ultimate vision was always home testing, through the STD regulatory process understanding and then looking at the flu process, we realized that you have to take one step into clinical first and then go towards home use. And that was our strategy. The flu pivot actually worked out for us because that allowed us to get data on flu, on respiratory, that got the attention of BARDA. And BARDA at that point in time was interested in at-home diagnostic testing. So that was sort of it was not necessarily a pivot, but that was a big boost of momentum towards our eventual direction, which was at-home settings. Through that funding, we were working on a lot of the aspects of the technology when the pandemic hit. And again, we found ourselves in this interesting situation where we had respiratory disease technology, and a lot of the work around usability, mechanical manufacturing was mostly behind us. And we had to focus mostly on the assay side of things, like creating a new assay for COVID. That was also a difficult decision. And we actually did not make it immediately when COVID came out. When the whole discussion started in Feb and stuff, it was not till March that we were able to basically all align and be like, look, we are doing COVID. That's our focus right now. We are doing COVID testing. So that was our third pivot. And when we were doing COVID testing, we decided to go full speed on the at-home side. And then that was a important thing for us, is that we did not want to go CLIA and then clinic and then go home. We wanted to go home. That led to our first authorization, which was prescription home. So FDA still wanted to create a few levels. So it was prescription at-home use. And then that translated to over-the-counter use in 2021.
There are so many things I can go after in this particular topic. First of all, I want to make sure the underlying technology is still the PCR-based technology. It changes color, it's easier to detect. It's the first of its kind. So that technology stayed the same, but then there's the use case being driven by the market dynamics here.
And some product features also pivoted. So when we first started, because it's a colorimetric, color-based chemistry, we wanted it to basically look and feel like a pregnancy test. Right, which means that visual readout. So we had chambers that you could visually look at. And that was our Gen 1 platform. What we realized from there is that these visual tests are not necessarily the best. There's a high degree of subjectivity involved in determining color changes, even with the lateral flow test. So much room for subjective interpretation as to what is the case here. We made a pivot on the technology side to go from this visual to the format that we have now, which is what we call electronic readout, where all the sensing happens inside. On the display side, when we first went on to this technology, our idea was to put an LCD display, which was sort of similar to what the electronic pregnancy tests had and other technologies had. And then for COVID, we decided to pivot again and move from that LCD display to a purely LED display, which basically is what the platform has. So on the technology side, again, we made changes, and in both situations, it was driven by the performance needs or usability needs added on top of the market needs. But I think what we wanted to do at every point, be flexible. If we have good direction in one way, we were nimble enough to move as needed.
Yeah, I'm glad you had that technology that is nimble enough to be adjusted to the market needs. Or I think I want to go off on a different limb here. Again, still stick to the story. Diagnostics are super hard. One, in my observation, my small stint at the diagnostic startup was that the market, there's not enough money there to pay for the diagnostics. And you're talking about at-home diagnostics. If you guys can talk about the dynamics of the complexities of making something in the lab and giving something to the patient, and what aspects of that makes it really hard, apart from the economical one, if it is actually a problem. And how did you see that? Did you have a clarity of how hard it is in getting approval? We'll go to the regulatory aspects a little later, but then purely from a technology and taking it to the market.
I think for us, it has been a learning curve on a lot of these things. When we started off, we did not have the clarity of what are all the difficulties that you're going to face with at-home diagnostic testing. I think I would say there are three main buckets that I think these sort of difficulties fall into. I think the first one is basically regulatory or / performance. FDA has for FDA at-home molecular infectious disease testing is extremely new. And while it might sound like lucrative, that's not necessarily always the best place to be in, because their assessment of risk and how to mitigate that risk through labeling, performance, and other features is extremely dynamic. And it's very interesting that I think although the experience was extremely stressful, you get a lot of insight from like how FDA thinks about things and what they really focus on. That was something that we did not have at all when we started off. When we started with SCD, remember we did a pre-sub with the FDA and we're talking about at-home STD tests, right? And they came back with this huge document of all the things that they would like to see.
And want to make sure for the audience, like pre-sub is something you submit to the FDA
right
before you build the product.
Yeah, so pre-sub is short for pre-submission. So the idea is that before you submit a PMA, pre-market authorization, or whatever you want to do with the FDA, you do a pre-submission discussion with them to make sure that you and FDA are aligned on what is it that you need to submit to the FDA. Those are non-binding recommendations, but usually, unless it's something drastic changes from a policy perspective, FDA usually holds fairly true to those pre-submission feedback. On the SCD side, we saw that whole like thought process unraveling in front of us a little bit in terms of what they wanted to see, what performance did they want to see, because they didn't know how to benchmark it. 2016 was also when they had a advisory meeting, which was also very interesting to see. For me, first advisory meeting for the FDA. So FDA has these panel meetings, and some of them are open to the public. So of late, people they have had for vaccines, all of that stuff for COVID. 2016, they had one which was focused on over-the-counter, meaning at-home diagnostic testing for infectious diseases. And that was also very interesting to see what kind of advisors they brought in and what their feedback was. So for us, we were building the puzzle a little bit, but this was not a puzzle where all the pieces have fixed graphics and you put them in. The pieces are changing in shape, size, and color while you're putting the puzzle together. So it's sort of like a very iterative process. And that's why initially we wanted to go the step-by-step approach, like go clinical where the pathway was much more clear, then make the leap to something where FDA was comfortable with the technology. Now let's move them into a different area. But I think that was a big area of information that was not available to us. And I don't think still there is a clear guidance that anyone can get for at-home diagnostic testing. You can use precedents, you can use the Luciras of the world and the others of the world to sort of build a story, but you should not be surprised if FDA has some new risks that they have identified. So that's one bucket. The other bucket is around usability. And I think that was an area where we as a company were doing some amount of work, but it was not until a team member joined the company who had a lot of consumer product experience that we sort of changed our thought process drastically, where we became extremely customer centric. And that's a key. If you look at the Lucira product, every detail in that has been fine tuned from a usability perspective. From how much force you need to close the cap, right, to how bright the LEDs are and how they're located, battery, door, how is that designed, everything. And that is something that for us, we did not focus as much on it in our early days, but I'm so glad we did, because that is what made it pretty much a no-brainer. I still remember for COVID, the way we did our clinical testing is we drove around in San Diego, going from house to house, because you could not have them come to a clinical site without all the precautions and whatnot. So we got into bunny suits. This was like 2020, no vaccine, nothing. We had people come out of their house into open their either driveways or front yard. We brought a table in. We were dressed head to toe like a hazmat suit, and the person was running the test. And then we would go clean it up. But we were able to do all of that because the usability aspects of the device were so well fine-tuned at that point in time, so that we did not have to worry about, what will happen if someone who is sick, has fever, standing outside in the sunlight, is unable to do some aspect of it. And then the third category is, how do you get at-home diagnostic testing out there? I think getting an authorization is one step, but scaling up manufacturing and figuring out distribution channels when none of those exist right now, that is another key aspect of challenges that we face for the COVID and the COVID flu products, was understanding how to put all those pieces together. And then the finance you mentioned, economics, it's all tied together to the manufacturing scale, to insurance providers covering it or not covering it, right? Or why are they not covering it sort of questions, to how many do you want someone to buy at a time if it is not reimbursed. So all of those are like white space, right? Like at-home testing is completely a white space. I think the pandemic did accelerate. It also created roadblocks of its own that will now take years to overcome. But what it has created is that discussion in that white space. And the reality is we still don't know a lot about how to make it happen in a much more sustainable fashion.
Wow. Just thinking about it is like painful.
It was.
Being there and building this. Let's go down each of these buckets. Regulatory. You always knew that FDA was going to be a big hurdle that you had to pass. And when you first started, what were you thinking in terms of like, how are you going to navigate this path? Who are the people that helped you in shaping that? And walk us through that journey of the final approval with the FDA. John, you want to start at the beginning of the time?
Yeah, at least I can talk about the early part. So in the early days, and I'm sure at the later days too, but at least under my knowledge, we tapped into regulatory consultants. And, it took us a couple of times to find out which ones were helpful to us, because a medical device regulatory consultant has particular areas that they specialize, and so you may not be the best fit for them. So we eventually stumbled across a woman named Erica Hamarati. She's a fantastic point of care regulatory consultant. So she helped us a lot, and she had a strong partnership with Carol Chen, one of the early team members. And Carol was in charge of director of clinical and regulatory at Diassess. And so she and Erica really worked on building the strategy, and we all would help too. But like Carol led the pre-submission process. We went to Washington, D.C., met with the FDA in person, laid out our strategy. It was really cool because obviously when we presented, they had never seen anything like this, right? Like as Deb said, the Abbott ID Now, which used to be the Lear I, which used to be the iCUM, was the first CLIA waived instrumented nucleic acid test in 2014. And here in 2015, 1 year later, we're presenting this test that is completely disposable and could be completely used at home in just a matter of 12 months. And in terms of what the FDA sees, you could definitely tell that they've never seen anything like this. And it's kind of like, if you look at it from their perspective, they probably weren't expecting anything like this for probably another 10 years. And particularly so if you look at that 2016 meeting, based on the conclusions and the write-up from that, was really strep throat, flu, highly unlikely it would ever be cleared for at home. STD, there may be a shot because of the cost, but they make a lot of these decisions based on cost benefit analysis. STD, I think, was potentially the most promising path to at home. But generally, if you read that document, you'd walk away and be like, wow, there's highly, highly unlikely that any at-home test ever gets cleared for the US public based on reading that in 2016. So for us, that's why we were so focused on getting CLIA waiver, getting professional use first. But yeah, going back to the regulatory side, it was definitely an iterative process for us. There was definitely some key learnings. And I would say each submission or each clinical trial is unique in itself. You have a predicate device, you have the comparator device that you actually compare to physically in the clinical trial. The predicate outlies in the paperwork of like the,
Substantial equivalence.
Exactly, and the instructions for use and all that on the documentation level, but the comparator is really at the bare bones, what you're comparing to in the clinical trial head to head. That's where there's a lot of learnings. At the end of the day, it's a game, and various companies will rig the game to their advantage. You really don't start to realize this until you go through a clinical trial and you run their platform and you're like, wow, there's some unreported issues with this platform that then, because you're doing a head-to-head analysis, maybe detrimentally impact your own test performance. And so this is one of the things that definitely should be improved, the way this 510K analysis is performed, because over time, if you stack tests that perform 95% against the prior predicate, and the FDA encourages you to use the most recent device, if you do this 10 times and you multiply 0.95 compounded to the 10th or whatever, you're going to have like an 80% or less accurate test, probably less, 60%. I don't know what the math is. But like over time, this process essentially drives insensitive tests onto the market. And so when you have a highly sensitive test and you're being told you have to compare it to this comparator, then that impacts your chance being cleared. And guess what? You don't get cleared because you don't perform to that comparator. You actually perform better, but that shows up detrimentally in your specificity. So there's learnings like this that you don't know until you play the game. And so you play the game, and this is the problem with startups in this space, because startups often don't have the funding to do another 12 months. Like if you are in a seasonal business like we are, you do the clinical trial. If you don't have enough clinical samples, or you don't choose the right comparator, or you don't push back against the FDA that you guys are encouraging us to use the wrong comparator, if you don't do those things and you don't have runway for another 12 to 14 months, guess what? Your company is out of business. So these are the insights. And I feel like there's a generally wide sweeping strokes here. There's a lot of regulatory consultants out there. And I think there's very, 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 very few that have been in these situations that can bring these insights to the company. And so this is where, on the regulatory side, it is immensely valuable to understand the game that is being played and play it to your advantage. And so that was definitely one of the things that we learned the hard way early on during my time at Diassess. Now, I'm not saying this is the FDA's fault. It's just the way the system's set up. There's a lot of great people at FDA, a lot of hardworking people. I had friends there that have worked there, and they're smart people. But I think this is just, things can be improved. This system works to the advantage of strategic large companies that don't have to worry about making payroll in 12 months to do another clinical trial, but is not advantageous for an innovative startup pushing the bleeding edge and developing innovative technologies. That's where I think when you see the COVID pandemic unfold, it created this riff in time where you had 200 startups trying to do infectious disease testing, and not many of those are going to survive because the system is not set up so those technologies in the current framework come to market. And I'm sure the FDA will probably do retrospective here and understand this and improve this down the road. But that was just kind of like what we experienced. And I think I'll let Deb talk after this because this is a long-winded answer. But the running joke in at least our industry, diagnostics, was that you don't want to be the first company in the market. And you look at the OraSure HIV test that took 7 years to go through their regulatory process. They were the first HIV at-home test in the market. You want to be the second. You want some other company to go through that struggle, push the bounds, and then you all of a sudden you can then, instead of being a PMA, or they didn't even have de novo process when we started, it was PMA. Instead of doing de novo or PMA process, you could be a 510K predicate as the second company. You can come in, you didn't spend $50 million trying to push your product through, you spent $10 million or whatever, and then you can spend $40 million on marketing. That is a much better strategy. And that, unfortunately, is how the medical device world is set up. Everything from diagnostics to stents, you can see that.
That is extremely frustrating as founders. First of all, navigating something new, and then there are all these hurdles, which is not your fault per se, like comparing your product to something that is not working as well. And you mentioned something about non-binding recommendations from FDA. Why are they non-binding? Has it affected you guys? Because they gave you some feedback and you took that to work on that.
It's non-binding because that's the policy. I don't think FDA ever gives binding recommendations in these pre-submission discussions. Maybe in certain circumstances, I'm not a regulatory guy, so I'm not sure exactly what the history behind that is, but that is sort of the trick here. And this is where it's not being the first product out there going through this is helpful, because if you're the first one going through it, the only thing that you have to base anything on is that non-binding recommendation from. If you are the second product, then you have that non-binding recommendation, but you also likely have the previous company's authorization. And generally what happens if they didn't do it under the EU framework is that once they open the horizons on certain direction, then they come up with a guidance document for the industry. So this is basically more information for them, which again are guidance by terminology, meaning it's non-binding. I think the things that FDA is trying to balance here is providing direction, but not driving a product through their system. For example, they answer yes and no question. You cannot put an open-ended question, hey, how do I validate the system? No, you tell them, I'm going to do this validation. Does FDA agree that this is appropriate? And then FDA can go into detail saying, no, here's why. So FDA has also gone through its own learnings over the years on how best to organize that. But yeah, it can be frustrating. And I think frustration also can be pretty much an existential threat to a company, right? Where you move ahead due to certain assumptions. And then if those assumptions change on your head, you have nowhere to go.
And you have to go back and do the whole clinical trials again just to get to that new data point. Expensive and it's existential threat.
Right. And while you can scientifically argue a lot of these things, when it comes to actual decision making, science definitely plays a big role. But also is important is making sure everything is done according to their process. Well, the example that John was saying is that if your comparator in a clinical study is performing poorly, you cannot do some sort of bench evaluation to sort of say, oh, okay, this is the impact. Can we correct for this? No, you have to scrap everything and start from scratch. There are companies that do these infectious disease testing for decades, trying to get drugs or testing. But for a young startup, it definitely becomes a big hurdle there. Yeah. On the regulatory consultant side, I think one thing I would add is that there are a lot of ex-FDA people who jump in the consulting game. Then the only thing I can add there is that being in the FDA is not a recipe to make the right regulatory calls. The argument being made is that, oh, now you can get the insight from the other side of the table. But the reality is that it's rarely that anyone makes a sole decision in the FDA. It's usually a much bigger process. So talking to one peg in that wheel, you get much better guidance from someone who has been on your side of the table, not the other side, on your side of the table, and has dealt with the wheel rather than talking to a peg in that wheel. That has been my biggest learning, is that usually I try to stay away from people who have like all these FDA affiliations on their thing and go towards people who have actually pushed things through the FDA.
That's great advice, because as an early stage founder, it's almost like a checkbox that you need to have. FDA is like so far away. I need somebody to advise me, and who better than somebody from FDA, which might not be the best advice for you as a founder. Sorry for that detour. I wanted to continue that journey of getting that approval from FDA. What did that process look like from a technology point of view? And how was that interaction like, the back and forth?
So it was a very collaborative process with the FDA, which was both very helpful, but also frustrating. at certain points. I think we were extremely lucky that the people driving our original COVID authorization were familiar with our technology, basically were in the meeting where we presented our flu test to the FDA in 2016 or something. So like they have known for us for like that whole 5-year duration and have been involved in various interactions we have had with the FDA since. So that was very helpful. They had a baseline. But yeah, I think for us, we had many pre-EUA discussions. They were called for the EUA, where we went through first like at home. FDA is like, we need clinical tests right now. Let's focus on that. Then when the situation was right, we went back again when there were enough clinical tests and they were like, okay, let's do prescription first. And then we went got more data and then we got the final OTC. So it was extremely iterative. Directions were changing on a monthly basis on what they needed to see, how they needed to see it. From a technology perspective, we got the technology down pretty quickly in 2020. I think we had our working prototypes in the July-ish timeframe, starting from March, which was crazy fast for us to have done that July-August timeframe. But feedback from the FDA on what needs to happen, and then this need for clinical data. Because if you are a lab-based test, you can do remnant samples, frozen samples. But for a test like ours, you cannot do frozen samples. You have to do fresh samples. So we started one clinical study, and it was in Northern California, which was in a clinical site. And during that time, 2020 was also when the wildfires were going crazy. So our clinical collection was basically a drive-through clinic where someone with symptoms would come and participate in that study. And the collection there had to be tamped down because no one wanted to come out when there was like just smoke everywhere. That's when we moved to SoCal and did that community style study. So it was just like, to me, like it was very exciting. I think I only have fond memories of that time, even with all the craziness, because it was like creation. Everyone was in the zone. The entire company was aligned. Everyone was like, okay, what do you need? We had vendors who would not talk to us before COVID, being like, hey, how can we help? We had labs who were like, oh, we have extra space here. We had people who reached out to us saying, hey, can I volunteer in the lab? I have qualifications. Can I volunteer? I don't need pay or anything. Can I just volunteer in your lab? It was really good to see that sort of coalescing. And with the FDA, yes, there was back and forth, but we were aligned in the way that something like this is needed, and they were trying to work with us to figure out how to get us there.
Wow. What this journey? First, you guys thought that you need a clear waiver so it'll go to the hospitals, but become an at-home test. It's such a huge joy. I think that's the word I try to tell people why people do startups. I think there's a lot of joy that comes with it. I think we'll come back to the point of joy a little later too, but I wanted to go back to the second bucket of your product development. You guys were scientists from the lab. You never built a product. Talk us about the obstacles that you had to overcome. And then finally, what did that final team look like in terms of who built the product? What was missing and what were the learnings in this process? If somebody's trying to build a startup now, how should they start differently from you guys?
With us, products in this space is probably like 10% of it is actually building the product development. I would say probably 40% of it is the clinical trials and the filings and meeting with the FDA. And probably the other 50% is probably building a quality control system, complying to that, getting the licenses to manufacture a medical device in California, implementing that quality system across the company. I was at Lucira or Diassess up until 2019. It was kind of amazing that the actual product development was such a small sliver of time. And I think insanely creative, super fun, and iterations continued after that. Clay Reber was an amazing product engineer that continued to improve the usability as Deb described earlier. But once you have the idea and you start to understand how to manufacture it, it's then all these other extraneous things that you need to go out and seek expertise and make sure that you're implementing them correctly in your company. So that was definitely very fond memories. And I have a picture of all the different iterations we went through, and from a very academic prototype to something that actually is being manufactured. So yeah, it was quite the journey, but it's also the product development in the space is so much more than the actual product.
Product development is a process. And I think academia does not teach you how to do that. And for us, coming straight out of academia, I think what we were very focused on was what is the first step of a product development process, which is feasibility. It's basically a lot of research, highly creative, and the goal is to basically get to a point where you can say with some degree of certainty that I can do this repeatedly. That is also a place where it's a very non-linear phase in terms of thought process and development, in the sense that you can come into lab one day and basically one experiment can either extend your projected timeline by a year or cut it by 6 months. You have very little ability to plan, and that's okay because that's the whole point of that phase. But I think that for me, the biggest thing leading sort of the technical development through the 9 years was to understand that as John pointed out, that is just not a minuscule, but it's a part of the process. And there's a lot more that needs to go into that, including investors, right? Including business people, like marketing people, everyone needs to be part of that process. Outside of research, outside of the academic mindset, which I think the PhD program trains you fairly well on, or this non-linear thing, of all these what ifs, or the hesitancy to say an experiment will work or not, is to convert that non-linear thinking into a linear projection, right? It's almost like two dimensions, right? Research is one dimension, development is a whole other dimension. In research, everything is non-linear. Everyone is like, no one is sort of thinking of like step A, step B, step C, step D. They're thinking about ideas, troubleshooting on the fly, all of that stuff. But that needs to be projected into a space where everyone has a very linear thinking, because they don't have the PhDs and 5 years of training doing this kind of stuff. So regulatory person, right? Like you cannot give them what ifs of the wazoo. You have to be like, okay, this is our end goal. Tell me the steps, right? Linear thought process. What are the steps here? Manufacturing, same thing. I want to get this. Tell me the steps. How do I get there? And that, I think, is a key thing that if one of the founders is leading the technical organization, they should train on. Because if they are straight out of academia, I am fairly certain that they are not familiar or comfortable with that process. And there are a lot of good resources that are out there. But for us, we talked with Pete Daly, who was at Cepheid, right? And he has a course at Berkeley now. He actually runs a course on product development for infectious diseases. And those are the kind of material that I would encourage technical founders to seek out, because they are in the role where they have to basically learn that. And I think without learning that, jumping into product development is going to lead to a lot of churn, a lot of work, but not directed towards a goal. And I think that was one of my biggest learnings. The other key thing on the development side is to basically not be a hammer that is looking for a nail. You need to find the problem. And for us, we were lucky enough that we started off from that mindset. We were like, this is the problem we want to solve. And then we started developing all the technology around it, like the colorimetric detection, the fluidics, all of that was towards a goal. We did not come out of the lab with this colorimetric technology and we're like, oh, where can I apply that? A lot of the times when you're trying to commercialize technology out of academia, because the original work did not have nail and hammer mindset, you sometimes find yourself with a hammer without knowing where to hit it. And I think that is where product development, again, the non-technical founders play a big role, technical founders play a big role, because this is where the collaboration happens. Identifying markets, but also understanding what is doable, what is not feasible, right? What is doable, because you have to deliver on it with minimal risk. Then the third important thing for me has been understanding the value of luck, but also deriving from that, having backup plans. A lot of the time, people say backup plans are non-efficient. I am a startup. I don't have money to put into plans ABC. I have plan A, and I'm going to Thelma and Louise that. Go over the cliff on plan A, but you don't have to do that. Plan B and plan C can be things that are there, and I cannot even count the number of times when my plan B became the plan A because something blew up in plan A. And that, I think, in product development is very important for the technical founders to keep discipline on, and encouraging people to always have backup plans in their mind. Because if something doesn't work, you don't want that to be the last mistake that you see as a company.
I think that probabilistic thinking is really important, more than that deterministic way of like I'm the leader, and their ego is driving a lot of those things there, I believe. We talked about the regulatory, we talked about the product. I think the third bucket you talked about was the distribution channels. From what I understand, a lot of the deep tech startup companies, they don't try to go to IPOs, and they try to find a bigger company to get acquired or plug themselves into their distribution channels. What were you guys thinking when you first started the company of like how you would go to the market, and how did that evolve? And I think big piece connecting in all of these aspects is there's timing and there's luck. We'll touch upon those subjects, but I just wanted to get out your thought process of how you thought would go to the market. John.
When we started doing the market analysis, you start realizing that with diagnostics and medical devices, there is a clinical labs fee schedule for how much they'll pay for tests. And so from there, okay, this is what CMS, Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services, this is what they pay the healthcare facilities that use their tests. And so CMS they pay the most out of everyone. And they're about 50% of the market. And then it's the private insurers and the private health plans that pay typically 70 to 80% of what CMS plays. So this is all learning, starting to understand how this happens. And then you start to go and you learn about the distributors. And the distributors take between 30 and 40%, sometimes 50% of that final price, because they have salespeople that go out and knock on the doors and tell the central lab director, you should buy this test over this test. And you start doing the math and you start to figure out, okay, how much you can sell the product to the distributor. And then you start to do your BOM and you start to figure out, okay, what are my margins? And I think early on in startups, I also see this early stage founders not doing this work enough, figuring out what their unit economics are. How much does the distributor take? How much is cost to acquire, the customer cost? All this stuff is really important to do early on. Why bother raise money if you don't know these intricate details? Like you could spend the next 7 years of your life building this product and slowly figuring out this information, but you might as well just do it up front. But anyway, to answer your question, the market and the regulatory aspects change, right? The FDA changes its mindsets, like the FDA changes its mindset. The market also changes. And in a sleepy industry like the diagnostic world pre-COVID, the market changed like every 6 months. There'd be new groundbreaking products entering the market. And then around 2017, Congress introduced the Protecting Access to Medicaid and Medicare Act, PAMA. And so the goal of this was to reduce healthcare costs. And the way they were going to do it, of diagnostics, it's probably 2 to 3% of all the healthcare costs. They decided to pick on diagnostics and reduce the costs of diagnostics. And so this was a 6-year legislation program to reduce the cost that CMS was going to pay for its tests. They essentially then pinned this to the central labs. And so each year, CMS would pay 90% that they paid the prior year. They would survey 2,000 labs and they would reduce the cost, and they'd step down over 6 years. And so I think the projection at that time was like $98 STD test was going to come down to $47. And you're like, oh my God, this is an existential threat to you, right? You've been at this point, we've been 5.5 years in grad school. We have been at the company for 4 to 5 years at that point. You're like, oh my God, I have so much sunk time in this, and they're reducing the cost. It doesn't make any real sense if you are trying to reduce the cost of healthcare. Things like that inevitably happen, and you need to figure out how you're going to deal with that. So that was one of the interesting things that happens, because there are all these macroeconomic events that you can't control, but make you stressed out. Interestingly enough, COVID disrupted that plan. Prices went in the other direction for a year or two. But yeah, it's important to understand that stuff, whether you're talking to a distributor or you're looking at a draft of congressional legislation. Like, you got to do the work and you got to understand what you're getting into. So that's kind of what we learned along the way.
Did you talk to any big companies along your way?
All the time. I think every time we had a fundraising round, we coincidentally had another big company that we're talking to that we were in strategic conversations with. And that always helped in fundraising cement the interest of the investor. It's signal from the market. It's really hard to have signal that early on when you're a startup, but when you have a strategic you're talking to and they're giving you time, investors will take that. And the other thing is, you can't make it up. Don't go around making this stuff up. The investor's not going to check, but you have to be honest. And we were always talking to strategics. And Y Combinator will say, don't waste your time at corporate development. While that may be right, you need, in such a difficult market, you need to have, as Deb said, a plan B or plan C. If you need to get acquired, maybe the strategic will be the lead investor. You need to create options. When you have so few options, your job as a CEO is to create options, right? And so if you're in a different position, that's fantastic. Maybe you don't need to spend so much time talking to strategics.
Yeah, the strategics become very important for early stage companies. And I think it's almost like one of the things early stage founders try to do. And almost everybody is talking to big companies. And what are the lessons you learned while talking to these big companies? Again, signal to noise ratio. How do you find the right ones to continue the conversation with, or otherwise the tail wagging the dog there? Because most of the times, at least from my personal experience working with big companies, is that they almost won't come in until you get the FDA approval. Any thoughts on that? Because it was frustrating because, yeah, it's a signal to the investors, but beyond that, the onus falls on you to raise the money and through the whole thing, and you cannot really use their internal expertise, whether it is regulatory or product manufacturing or distribution. How does one navigate this pathway?
When you're the CEO, founder, and you're pitching your company, you're essentially selling your company to investors or to customers, you need to craft a narrative. If talking to strategics helps you craft that narrative of XYZ Pharma is interested in us because they have XYZ drug that they need help, we are a diagnostic that will expand that market, you need to go talk to that pharma and craft that into your narrative. That's like really important. At the same time, don't go around wasting too much time. There's a difference between talking to a director at a pharma company and the VP or C-suite. Getting real buy-in from the C-suite or the higher up in strategic you go, the more likely that they're serious about you. So you can tell how serious they are based on who you're talking to and how far up the food chain you go. But at the same time, there is utility in talking to lower level individuals. If you can add that information to your narrative, and it helps you craft the value proposition of your startup.
I think the thing to know about strategics is that they are not a monolith with one direction and one vision. And I have seen them change their mind after spending tens of thousands of dollars in diligence, right, with consultants and stuff, because the next level up did not eat breakfast that morning and was grumpy in the meeting, and there goes your deal, right? Or the CEO changed and the new CEO, it does not want to do and take risk with new initiatives. So it's fickle. And strategics are also, if you look at it from a strategic perspective, they are also getting an inbound of all these potential opportunities. So I think it is important to have those discussions. And I don't think it's wasting time if you talk to them and nothing panned out of it, because it is a waste of time if you are going in there with your blinders on. This is the deal that I need to do. And if I don't get this deal done, then that was a waste of my time. If you go into these discussions trying to understand what is it that the strategics are interested in, then it is not a waste of time, because you know that what you're offering does not fit their need and why. And then you can make a choice, hey, do I want to pursue this or not really? So I think talking to strategics is not a waste of time if you go in there thinking that it is basically a learning opportunity. As you should be talking to customers, especially as a founder, your job is to absorb as much information as you can from strategics, from customers, maybe from competitors if you can get those connections in to understand what is it that you're trying to build and sell.
Lots of food for thought there for early stage founders. Let's slightly shift gears and talk about your journey towards the IPO. I see that there was a change in the leadership along the way. I want to get the story behind that and going to IPO as opposed to raising more venture capital money. At that point, what were those decisions like? Maybe, John, you can first take a stab at this. Start with the leadership transition and anything that other founders could learn, because you, at an earlier stage, you mentioned about venture capitalists who always come in and say like, oh, I'm going to change the founding CEO. I hear a lot of those stories. What is going on there?
Yeah, particularly traditional VCs and East Coast VCs may not particularly be a bad thing if you as a founder can stay in the company and learn from an experienced CEO that comes in, replaces you. I've had a couple of friends that have been in that situation. It's worked out well. Being on the West Coast, typically the VCs are more supportive, obviously, of the founder CEO role. My own personal experience, I think a lot of CEO founders tie their personal identity to the startup. In ours, nowhere else is that more true with Deb and I because of the way things worked out. So it was really hard. It's like tearing your heart out of your chest when you are no longer CEO of something that you worked so hard to build and you persevered. In hindsight, it was a really good thing for me. I had not realized how mentally of a burden it was on me. It really allowed me to reset and really decouple my personal identity and realize what's important to me in life. What do I really care about accomplishing? As opposed to, I think founders, they think about they have to be successful to have a decent life. But that's not true. 99% of startups don't succeed, right? So for me, I kind of knew my time was limited based on the investor options we had early on in the company. When that happens, it usually occurs when the founder is at the most vulnerable point. For us, I was raising our Series B. I'd spoken with and pitched 86 investors, including strategics. It was such a drag. I think it was over 8 or 9 months. And we had finally found a strategic diagnostic company to invest. And so I was like, oh my God, finally we have someone to lead the round. Our investors wanted an external party to price the company and lead the round. And so it's really intriguing because VCs don't want to lead their own investments round after round because they want an external entity to price it. If they price themselves, then it leads to sometimes higher markups and not the true market rate. So VCs are really skittish about continuing the lead rounds that they had previously led. So the strategic it ultimately dragged out for, I think, 3 or 4 months through Christmas Eve, through New Year's. At that point, the company was insolvent. And when the company is insolvent, when you're on the board of directors, you have personal liability to that company. So we were going through a clinical trial. And I think I remember looking at the 1 month, we had $1 million being spent. And it was just incredibly, incredibly stressful to be a founder and then realize that you're not getting paid much and the VCs, and then all of a sudden you're like, oh, I have $1 million in liability that where in America, you can't expunge that from your personal record. It was just terrible, terrible time. It was a really, in hindsight, incredible life lesson and really good in hindsight. So anyway, I was forced to resign and investors ended up doing the round at that time. It was pretty painful and I am happy to talk to any founders that end up in that situation. I continue to do. But 4 years down the road, I'm really happy that happened to me. It really was kind of a moment of enlightenment for me.
Thank you for sharing that story. I can only imagine the pain. And I think this is the reality of startups. And sometimes investors make the decisions that might not be in the best interest of the company or the founders. I know a lot of friends personally, and it's a very sad state of affairs. Moving along, Deb, there's new leadership. How was coping up with new leadership? Because it's a whole new team, I'm guessing, in the C-suite there. Talk about that story and that experience and any takeaways from that.
Yeah, I think when all of this happened, as John was mentioning, we were in the thick of clinical studies, which we did not have the money to pay for.
No, we did not.
At least at that point in time. So I think none of us, John or me, had given up on the technology itself, and we wanted to give it a shot at prime time. So I decided to continue leading the technical operations, and most of the company stuck through that transition because of that commitment to the mission. As John had mentioned previously, we were a very mission-focused group, and all of us could taste it. It's there. At-home molecular diagnostics is almost there. So that's what happened. The new leadership was brought in. Eric came in as the new CEO. I definitely enjoyed working with him. He brought in experience from different aspects of the business. I think it was an interesting transition because it's no longer your baby. I don't think it ever was. I think it's one of those falsifications that VCs throw at you to get you so emotionally involved, as John was saying, that your personality is tied to the company. The VC's personality is not tied to your company. Then why is your personality tied to the company? One of our early investors asked me, it was something to the end of like, what time do you go to sleep? And I said something. I was like, you should be thinking about work till that point in time. All that should be in your mind is just that. And while now I know the benefits of backup plans and everything, none of us kept any backup plans for ourselves, neither financially or career-wise or anything. Everything was all in on the company. And the way almost like mind control works is through indoctrination. It's not very different from a cult. This is the cult of the VC that you have here, where the cult is that if you are not thinking about work, then you feel guilty about it. We would go for lunch or dinner and we would talk about work. There was nothing else that any of us were talking about. And I have to thank our partners and our immediate family and friends who did not want to, like, there's nothing else to talk about. Everything was work related. It took me more time to get to that point because I was still in the thick of things. But for me, the transition had started, right, mentally, from like, this is your baby to being like, this is not anyone's baby. This is a company and you work in this company. You put in all the work that you can do. And then beyond that, you don't have control over everything that can happen. So you just move on with life. And to be honest, this transition happened and in 6 months you have COVID. And at that point in time, it became again this sort of whirlwind. And then I got my head out to breathe around like the 2022-ish time frame, early 2022, and got to the point myself, I was like, need to transition out because it's been 9 years. And I wanted to get that Zen state of having that outside of body experience. I think that was sort of the post-leadership transition, sort of how things went.
Thank you for sharing this story, because I think the investors and the pressure they put on the founders, I think it's not to badmouth anybody else, but it's not nice. They make it your life. And I think we discussed about it. This investors have 10 or 20 other investments going on. If you fail, it doesn't really matter because they'll make money one way or the other. But this is all for the founders. I think that's one good lesson to take away. Yes, put your focus on that. Don't make it your child. Deb, you mentioned about your partners and families and supporting you guys. That's very important for me because having been a founder myself and like, if not for my wife, I don't think I would have done the startup. Talk about that chemistry in terms of like, John, you mentioned about your then girlfriend, now wife, had to cover your rent at that point. They stick with you through the thick and thin. Tell about how supportive they were. And I hope the founders are going to be supportive for the spouses for the rest of their lives.
That's why Maslow's pyramid, to even have a chance of succeeding in the startup world, you got to be at the tip of the pyramid. You need to have financial stability. You need to have emotional stability. You need to be in a good place mentally because it will bring you down like a level or two, honestly. And so I always tell founders, like, your support network is so important. To me, my mom was an incredible listener. Raleigh, my wife, was an incredible supporter. Those two consistently I could turn to and talk to. It's just so important to have that support network. The entire startup journey, Deb was there. Ivan Dimov, we'd be on the phone until 2 a.m. We supported each other. It's just really important to have a few people that you can turn to and call whenever. It is absolutely critical. And I'm actually amazed that more investors don't ask founders, do you have a support network? Who do you go to? When they're doing diligence, I would think it'd be one of the first questions I ask when I do diligence on a company.
If they cared.
They should care because the company has a higher likelihood of success if the founders have a support network.
Same for me. I think having my wife, then girlfriend, Devi, and my family, my brother, my mom, all of them were supportive through the thick and thins. And I think that was very important because there are definitely moments where you were just like, did I do the right thing or not? And I think you need that support network to sort of keep you from going to the dark place where you just become self-destructive and doesn't help anyone. But I think having gone through that, to your point, you should not take that for granted. I think for me, it's important, right? Like, I had my fun. I had my 9 years, learned a lot, had a lot of fun, got 4 FDA authorizations, developed the at-home testing, molecular diagnostic test, made a lot of good friends and huge network, and that's awesome. I cannot expect that to be for my own sake, and especially for Devi's sake, this cannot be what happens every 5 years. Right? I cannot sustain it. So for me, I think it's very important that the next startup journey, where if I go down the founder route, or where I am right now in a startup that I did not found is to make sure that those learnings are put into place. It's very hard to forget all of these learnings when you're back into the thick of things, creating boundaries, knowing yourself and being very protective of you and your support network. And also just realizing that at the end of the day, you cannot control everything. And I feel like in the early days, that was a huge amount of stress, controlling everything. How will this clinical study go? Who will invest in the company? What will FDA say? At the end, we couldn't control any of this. At the end of the day, what led to the at-home testing was a pandemic that none of us had ever envisioned was going to happen.
Yeah, I think that is something that founders or would-be founders should really think about, that support network. I think I went through my startup for 9 years and my wife was there. The only person I wanted to prove myself right was for my wife. I wanted to succeed because she was supporting me. Ask me a question like, oh, we don't have that much money, or because all of my friends are like software engineers. It's hard. They're buying their homes and Teslas, and she never, ever did that to me. And then the friends were there. I think this is great advice that founders should actually have. If you don't have it, don't do it because you'll go crazy. On that note, I want to slide this conversation to the most joyous moments you had in the startup. Being in the startup for such a long time, there should be a few things that should be happily reminiscing. John, you want to go first?
Yeah, there's definitely a couple I can pick out. It's few. It's like one and maybe. I mean, the lows, there's many. Back in the early days, I just loved it. So much fun. I remember, we didn't go into this too much, but Deb was at 10X Technologies because we couldn't pay him the high enough salary to be on the H-1B visa. He would come home from work at 6 p.m. and then we'd be on the phone until like 2 a.m. working on the Diassess activities. And so that was for 11 months. And so that journey is just so memorable in terms of like absolute joy moments. When we discovered the color changing chemistry, this was such a theory and we were contentious and arguing with each other about whether it was going to work or not. We got in fights over it. I think we almost, between Deb, Ivan, and I, we almost could have strangled each other at different points. But then it worked. And then we were so excited. And we were at cloud nine. It was a patent that we could file. Another moment was we went through Y Combinator and we did the demo day. And it was such a struggle because we were a biotech company surrounded by tech companies. And we saw a company that was a med device company pivot to being a software provider. And they raised like a $70 million Series A from Sequoia within 2 months of the 3-month program at Y Combinator. So you're surrounded by like this type of stuff happening. And you're like, we're so slow, we're doing terrible. On top of this, Deb was locked out of the country. He had visited his mom. One of the highs was when we finished the demo day, Deb was coming back and we had 100 investors ping us after Demo Day YC. That was fantastic. Our phones were going off, all the notifications. Me and Ivan are standing there and there's a TechCrunch article about Demo Day and we are one of the pitchers. And it's just me and Ivan looking at our phones, our heads down and our drawers are dropping and we're talking about, holy crap, look at this. And then obviously as the company expanded, just so many moments with the team. One team member's birthday, another team member came in with this firecracker thing, confetti, and I just will always have this moment burned in my head because it was just the 14 of us after Series A celebrating a birthday, and we were all having so much fun. Like, it was just absolute fun. So it was the team coalesced really well, and just the moments like those. Deb, anything stick out to you?
Yeah, no, I think all of those, all the team events that we used to do, we went paintball, karaoke, so many different things. I think the other one was when we were submitting the BARDA
contract, yeah.
So not only do you have to submit a digital copy, you have to print, and these are proposals on like 300 of proposals. We have to print a copy and mail it to them. By the way, you have to do that with FDA as well. Very interesting how the government still relies on non-digital communication. But yeah, we were there at that FedEx. That was a pretty neat memory.
Getting $20 million from BARDA?
Yeah.
And that's another moment when it was like
when we heard
8 weeks later or something. And oh man, Chardol got the email and then it was just pandemonium for the next hour, I think, when we learned that happened. We were going through another cash crunch, separate one that time. Yep. And that BARDA contract was just like the last ditch effort to keep the company going at that time.
Yeah.
That was super important. Yeah. So as Deb said, lots of luck.
Well, that's a good transition to talk about near-death episodes. I think a good story has highs and lows, and let's go to the lows in terms of like, it's not ever a smooth journey for startup. And the point I'm trying to drive to other founders is that persistence. I mean, look at how far you guys have come. Like, and I wanted to understand about those near-death episodes where like, what was going on in your heads?
One of the good things about academia and academic training is that it does train you to persevere and to continue on. And definitely that's needed in the startup mindset of any founder. Yeah, so you can persist. In terms of the lows, I don't want to go through too many of those because I think I psychologically block those moments off.
Long repressed.
Very pressed, that's the word. But yeah, persistence is so important, but you can't persist through bankruptcy or like insolvency. There's certain things where you have to realize you just can't do anymore. And it's not your fault. It's luck. Another aspect that comes into play is you get on the hedonic treadmill. You go to honors undergraduate. You get 4.0 GPA. You go to grad school. You're going to the top 10 grad school PhD program. You're publishing work. You're on that treadmill. Oh, I'm going to start a company. I'm going to raise money. The thing that you don't hear about is the challenges. How many times have you failed in your life? I think a lot of people are starting to realize is that failure is such a critical learning technique for founders. If you go through your whole life with no failures, you're not going to be a very good founder because you need to rapidly iterate in your company. You're going to fail and you need to figure out how to overcome that, get around it. And this is something that Ivan Dimov was incredible at. And now he taught me and Deb, we would just fixate on how we can get around barriers. That's why some of the founders that may not come from the Harvards or Stanfords of the world succeed because they've failed and they know how to pick themselves up. At the same time, too much failure may be a bad thing, but like I think there's probably a sweet spot there.
Yeah, a lot of lows. We touched on one, which was around the insolvency. There were moments when the device did not work as expected. So on the product side, a lot of things that you thought were going to happen did not pan out. Lows also when team members, either the hires did not pan out or they had to leave for whatever reason. I think one of the biggest ones for me, and to be honest, when I think about the Lucira experience, there has been a lot of lows for the company. But personally for me, the things that stick is when we had to go through layoffs in 2017. That was by far the lowest moment in the company for me because these were people that we had brought in with a lot of care, integrated into the part of the company, and then had to lay them off because the company did not meet certain milestones. And it was the right decision for the company, but it was not a easy thing. And I think what John and I decided to do at that point in time was that this is not going to be an email that is sent out to everyone at the same time. In hindsight, I don't know whether that was the right approach or not because you had people just stressed out in the office, right? But it was something we chose to do. And I do not know whether everyone appreciated that or not, but it was a way for us to basically have a one-on-one conversation with each person, telling them why we had to make the decision. That's the one that sticks in my mind the most, the 2017 layoffs.
Yeah, I definitely second. That was terrible. I hated myself. I hated the situation. I hated the situation that I felt I got the company into there. That was just miserable.
Layoffs are always sad. I personally feel you guys did the right thing. You're not being an Elon Musk, just firing somebody over an email or text. I think that's a terrible thing to do. What were your coping mechanisms like? Firing somebody is hard. I cannot imagine. How do you cope and how should somebody plan for that? I don't even know if you can plan for that as a future founder.
I think you cope as you cope with other issues that you will raise, right? Like I think you need to have support. Something that I would tell my younger self would be that you need to dissociate your personal identity from the decision or the direction that a company is going, whether good or bad. I think it's very important to not like get your head in cloud nine when things are going well, but it's also conversely very important not to go into the depths of hell when things are not going well. You need to keep calm and neutral sense around you because everyone else is looking at you. So as a founder, if you break down, then your team breaks down with you. It's not to say that you should become a robot and not express. God knows, both of us expressed quite a lot during our times, but to make sure that you take your time and then you cannot rely on the team to help you recover. You have to find it within yourself and your co-founders.
Yes. Empathy is incredibly important. When we're talking about egocentric founders, empathy is definitely a characteristic needed in a founder. I think I realized people are not going to like me. You as a founder running your company, people are going to disagree with you. Not everyone's going to like you. People may not like you. And that's just part of the growth of your company, and you need to embrace that. And when you go through something as traumatic as a layoff, you got to feel for those people, right? That's why we chose to bring them in and talk to them one-on-one and explain the situation and how devastating it is. And at the end of the day, they're the ones getting laid off and not you. And so if you don't want to do these things or be part of these things, this is part of the human experience. Don't be a founder then. No one said it's going to be easier. To me, it's so far the hardest thing I've ever done in my life.
Startups are very, very hard, not for the faint-hearted. Well, I think we're coming to the end. We can have it on the podcast or not, but I just wanted to get your thoughts on the bankruptcy filing. You've seen everything, the lows and the highs of you guys actually saving lives because of your COVID test. You're the first to get an FDA approval. And I think a lot of things go because of luck. COVID tests happen because of unlucky for the world, lucky for the company, but you can actually prove the technology. What do you see the future of this technology? I see so much value in this one. And it's very unfortunate for the company to go under like that. Thoughts?
I don't know what I can say about the situation, but it is definitely unfortunate to be in this situation where in a period of 1 week, you go through a Chapter 11 filing and you get FDA authorization for the first ever at-home COVID and flu test. This is some shit that even like a movie fiction writer cannot come up with. But this is reality. If anything, this is in essence a nutshell. The last week is a nutshell of what the startup journey is. There are going to be ridiculously high highs where you have done something that no one else has done before. A record. No one can take that away. Right? This is it. This will be the case 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 40 years from now. Lucira technology was the first ever at-home COVID and flu test. But it will also be the case that during that entire period, the company went to the lowest low that a company can go through and is looking at mechanisms to reorganize and figure out how to continue to provide value. And my hope is that the technology survives this. And I think there's a lot of value in the technology, not the least of it, the validation from the FDA, that it behooves the general ecosystem to figure out how to push the technology forward. But bigger picture wise, I think what we did at Lucira was to open up an industry that did not exist, right? And I'm sure after Lucira, there's going to be a lot more technology that comes in. I think that is going to be, in my mind, always the Lucira story. Basically, going from a world where at-home molecular diagnostic was unthinkable to ending in a world where it was the norm. I definitely am really hopeful that the restructuring leads to a mechanism by which the technology survives and provides more products.
I agree with Deb. I think any revolution has fatalities, and if it ends up being a fatality, I think it ends up also being inspirational for more companies and more products and the movement of healthcare into at home and greater accessibility for people. So that was always, in some sense, the vision was achieved, mission accomplished. That's the positive in this. And so I think it's one hell of a story, stranger than fiction. And someday we're going to write a book and, maybe Tom Hanks or something stars in the movie. But at the end of the day, the vision is what we started out this conversation with and what carried through.
Yeah, it's a phenomenal story. Congratulations on what you achieved. And you paved the path for a bunch of future founders, I think. And then at-home tests, I think you're one of the first ones to actually drive that revolution. Now to my traditional closing questions. If you have to avoid one mistake in your journey, what would that be as a lesson to other founders?
With Lucira, I honestly tell people I have no regrets with how that went during my stint. It was a learning experience, And I made some incredible friends, lifelong friends, and incredible colleagues in time. So I have no regrets.
I would not classify this as a regret as much. Like, if there's one lesson for me here, is going to be that a company, one thing cannot define you as an individual. And I think that is something that I let Lucira define me as an individual for pretty much the last 9 years. And I think that that is the biggest learning for me. I don't think if I created boundaries, I don't think it would have changed the story. We would still have done what we did. But I would likely be a little better for wear at the end of these 9 years.
I agree. Super important lesson, I think. Tying your identity to one company and making yourself defeat or failure or success to that company is going to be hard on you as an individual. Like, I hope people can avoid that. And the second question is, if there are one or two people that played a significant role in this journey for you that you'd like to acknowledge. John?
Yeah, the founding team and the Series A team that I worked with, I think they each taught me things, and I learned a lot just from each day and every day. It's a ton of fun, but also incredibly memorable. And I don't want to name names, but it was just one heck of a ride, one heck of a team. So
and I think to add on to John's point, the team that has been associated with Lucira, who are not at Lucira right now, have gone on to do extraordinary. Within that cohort of the company, there are company CEOs of big, large companies, of like startups who are solving incredible problems, leaders in organizations, both public and private, leaders in organizations across the whole scale. But at the end of it, every single person being a good flag bearer for what we hoped the story of the Lucira team is. Mission-driven individuals who know how to get things done. So beyond the team, for me personally, I would say definitely my wife and Dr. Deborah Dean. My wife for obvious reasons, and my ability to go back home. Dr. Deborah Dean for being that guidance that I think was very important for us in the early days to sort of be set up for success.
Deb and John, thank you so much for sharing your story. I learned a lot, and I really hope they make a movie. If Tom Hanks is leading, who should be the second lead in that movie?
Oh, man.
I don't think Tom Hanks is going to be around when this movie's made.
All right. On that high note, thank you so much again. Okay. Good luck with everything.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Lab to Startup podcast. You can find links to the resources and programs mentioned in these episodes, connect with Naresh, or subscribe to this show at labtostartup.com.